Hello guys, welcome to the Code Lab channel and welcome to another episode in the 5 Minute Friday series. And in this episode we're going to be looking at naming CSS grid lines. Now, to help us understand naming grid lines, I find that it helps to first have a look at a picture representation of the syntax first. So if you look at this picture representation of a grid container, you can see we've got 4 tracks or 4 columns of content, each with a width of 1 FR. And you can also see we have lines either side of these columns, totaling 5 lines. Now, the confusion in naming grid lines can come from the fact that the lines aren't the columns themselves, they're actually the spaces between the columns, as you can see here. Now, for me, it always helps to remember when creating content in CSS Grid that it always starts with a line and it ends with a line, and then depending on how many columns you have, they would have lines in between those, as you can see in this picture here. Now, let's just say, for example, we want the first column to span across all the columns of the grid container. What you would do is use these grid lines as a reference point and then use the grid column property to span it across from the first line to the last line at the end of this grid container. Now, this is the conventional method, which is fine, but it can have its drawback because using numbered grid lines requires you to keep track of where the lines are on the grid, which can be a little bit confusing and frustrating at times. But another method we can use is actually naming the lines instead. And once we name these grid lines, essentially we create hooks for our content to attach to, and we can create cool layouts. So let's dive into VS Code now and create a grid layout with named grid lines. Right guys, so we're inside VS Code, and as you can see in the browser, we've got a grid container which has 4 columns. 3 of the columns have a width of 1 FR, and the 4th column here has a width of 15% because I want this to be a bit smaller because it's going to act as a sidebar, which you guys will see in a moment. Now, we've also got grid rows here. 2 of the rows have a height of 1 FR, and the middle row here has a height of 300 pixels because this is going to sort of act as the main content. Now, back to our picture representation. Every time we create columns or rows in a grid, there's a line at the start, a line at the end, and then depending on how many columns or rows you have in the middle, there'll be lines either side of those, which you can see here. Now, let's say for box 1 here, I want it to span across 3 columns. To do that, the conventional way would be for grid column, start on the first line and end on the 4th, which works pretty fine, but again, this can be a bit confusing for some people because we want it to span across 3 columns, but we need it to end on the 4th line, which again can confuse people. So naming them might actually be an easier outcome. So that's what we're going to do now. So I'm just going to delete that, and we're going to name the vertical and horizontal lines. So to name the lines, we first need to use square brackets, and I want the first vertical line to be site start, and the end vertical line to be site end. And then for our rows, our horizontal lines, I want to say row start and row end. Now, I also want to name the 2nd and 4th line here, so I'm going to say for this one to be content start, and then for the 4th line I want this to be content end. And now we've named these lines, these act as little hooks, and we can actually start using them for our grid columns and grid rows. So I'm just going to refresh that, revert it back, and for box 1 I'm going to say grid column, say I want this to start at the site start and end on content end. And if I refresh this, you see we get the exact same outcome as we've just seen. Now, for box 2 and 3, these are going to have this same style in here, so I want this to span across 3 columns. And I'll refresh that, and you can see now we're starting to get a really nice layout. Now, for box 4, you can see it starts at content end and ends on site end. However, this isn't really too helpful for me because I want this column to be defined as the sidebar, as this is going to be our sidebar. Now, a really cool thing about naming grid lines is that we can list as many names as we want. So if I go up here and where it says content end, which is this 4th line here, we can say sidebar start, and then for site end we can say sidebar end. So this is both the site end and the sidebar, as well as the content end and the sidebar start. Now, this makes more sense to me if I go inside box 4 now and I say grid column, we say sidebar start and sidebar end. You can see it stays in the same position. Now, another really cool thing about this is that grid knows that this is the sidebar column, so we don't actually need to write all of this out. All we can write is quite literally just sidebar, and it will know now it's the sidebar column. Now, the last thing we need to do here is just span it across all the rows. So I'm just going to say grid row, hit enter, and it's row start and row end. So the first row line and the last row line. So we're going to say row start and row end. Hit refresh, and you can see now it spans across all the rows. And again, because of that shorthand, we don't need to do row start, row end. All we need to do is just put in row, refresh this, and you can see we get the exact same outcome. And that's how we can name grid lines, guys. So a pretty cool feature of CSS Grid, and can be a much easier method for some people to remember and create cool grid layouts. Now just a quick helpful tip to wrap this tutorial up, guys. If you're still struggling with grid lines, the Firefox browser has an amazing feature in regards to the grid, in that it shows you the grid lines with the inspector tools. So if you ever get stuck on where your grid lines are, you can come on here, right click on the browser, open up the inspector tools, find the grid container class, and if we go to the right here, you can see we've got this little icon which says grid. Click on it, and if you look in the browser now, you can see it shows us the grid lines, and the same would apply if you're using Flexbox. It will show us the lines for the Flexbox. So an extremely helpful tool for a lot of people if you're still struggling with grid lines. But that'll be it for this video, guys. If you did like the content, please hit the like button and please consider subscribing. And if you guys have any questions, leave them down below, and I'll see you guys next time in the next 5 Minute Fridays episode.